everyone, and welcome to our research presentation for wildlife behavior. We chose to do wildlife foraging in Clemson, South Carolina, and our group was Haley Campbell, Devin Mundell, and Ari Bragg. So some background information on our study is our objective was to study whether the habitat type, whether that was in a forested area or a field area, was affected the degree to which wild hogs use their memory for foraging. Our hypothesis was the wild hog uses prior experience of food availability in areas to make foraging decisions without traveling large distances. So the species that we studied was native wild or non-native wild hogs in South Carolina. They typically are about 2.1 to 4.1 feet at the shoulder. That kind of depends on if you're looking at males or females. Males usually weigh around 170 to 220 pounds, and females are 130 to 180 pounds. They're mostly omnivores, but they will eat quite literally anything. They're native to Eurasia, which is parts of Europe and Asia and North Africa. They're currently an invasive species, and their breeding season typically is November is the peak, so the fall and farrowing season is March or any time in the spring. So the location that we decided was the Woodburn Barn location, which is in Pendleton, South Carolina, right across from Tri-County. We selected 5 different areas, which are indicated by the blue circles, and you can see the barn and the house are indicated by the red dot and square. So our different locations kind of looked like these. We had one that was real forested, one that was kind of a forest field mix, another forest field mix field, and then the field behind the barn. And then this was a 360 view based on one of our locations. That was directly behind the barn at Woodburn. All right.
Thank you, Haley. So with each location, we set up or installed motion-activated game cameras where we were able to record both photos and videos whenever movement was detected amongst the wild hogs. And so from using these game cameras, we marked foraging plots within each habitat, and then within each of those locations, we were able to individually identify those hog movements between those locations. And so we had also utilized the game cameras to monitor high-yield food sites, assessing whether the hog showed a preference for either the field forested mix, or that forested location. And so we also use rooting activity as an indicator for site selection. And so from this, we collected data on the site revisit frequency, where we're able to determine the number of days an individual hog reappeared at a site, the site preference, to where the total hog visit per location and the group foraging trends were kind of noticed and seen. And then the distance traveled, we had estimated that based off the time gaps between individual appearances between different site locations, as well as the distance from each site to its closest water source. And so for the data analysis, we used a one-way ANOVA to determine the revisit frequency, where we compared the differences across all the 5 locations to determine the differences in the site preferences, which was just seen as the average hog visit per day. Then we have the travel patterns, which we use just a correlational graph to determine the time gaps between the individual appearances at those different sites. And then we used a correlation analysis as well to determine the relationship between the revisit frequency and its distance to water. And so for our ANOVA table, we have the F value, which came out to be 20.25, and a P value, which was shown to be around less than 0.05, or the standard. And so what we can determine here is that we can reject the null hypothesis, meaning that there are significant differences in the average visits per day among those different applications. And so here we have a table where the wild hogs consisted of about adult females, their young, and a dominant male, for the site 1 location, site 2, and site 3. For site 4 and 5, those are mainly just either adult males or just I mean, adult females or a couple of younger hogs. And so what we kind of seen from here is that with the overall data that we had collected from each of these sites, the hog number was lower than we had expected due to the farrowing season. So more females that will be in a fixed location, or more females were in a fixed location that was out of our view of our game cameras. And so from these graphs here, for the proximity to water graph, you can see that the hogs at the locations closer to a water source, they revisited the sites more often than the sites that were further away from the water source, which is shown where site one had the highest average visit per day, and site five being the least. And this indicates that the hogs they were able to recall that the higher yield sites in water resource density or just water abundance were just more preferred over the ones that are further away. And then as for the following graph, we have that the average visits per day in site one and site two were the highest. This also can this also shows us that hogs they can use their memory to return to the sites that are more energy efficient when traveling to more favorable site locations. And again, site one is going to be that forested type of field, and then site two is going to be that forested field mix location. And so overall, the forested locations, they have the greatest hog density and are the locations that the hogs will recall the greatest compared to the field locations.
All right, thank you all. A little bit of previous research we did, we looked at a couple articles. This one, for example, was looking at the Savannah River site in on the South Carolina-Georgia border. It was mainly looking at the vegetation types like the shrubland, pines, bottomlands, hardwoods, all that kind of stuff. And it also looked at the difference between males and females and their traveling habits. Their methods actually differed from ours quite a bit. They baited and corralled their hogs and tranquilized them and put radio collars on them and then set them free. And they measured their every movement pretty much. And they found that the males traveled quite a bit further and in a more consistent pattern than the females. Females traveled less and had a more variable pattern, which might coincide with the farrowing season. The females selected all vegetation areas. They didn't have a preference on where they went, but the males preferred the upland pines, shrubs, and bottomland hardwoods and areas close to roads. I forgot to mention the females also preferred proximity to streams and rivers. So yes, the males chose bottomlands, hardwoods, and shrubs mostly. And for the next study, this one was looking at the Pantanal wetland. Excuse me. Hogs chose the sites associated with short-term memory. Before I get into that, these are looking at just general wildlife movement patterns and activity. But there was one section in there that focused on wild hogs, and they found that the wild hogs chose sites based on short-term memory as opposed to long-term memory. And this is likely due to vegetation responding to foraging behavior / pressure, and also water availability. They mentioned that in there as well. And familiarity was more important during the day than at night. So yeah. And for future research, some potential implications that we have talked about here or discovered here are predicting hog movements and to improve land management. As we know, hogs are a big problem here in the South. They tend to destroy environments and they are invasive. We could also enhance baiting and trapping strategies, although we did not use baiting or trapping in our experiment. The results that we found in the movement behavior could help to improve ideas on where to put baiting or baits or traps and those sort of things, obviously with the right permissions. And also we could, in the long run, mitigate the agriculture damage caused by hogs. For future research, we could increase camera density. We only had access to 5 game cameras. Ideally, we would have used more, but we had to use what we had. Um, so we could have a larger study area, or maybe a more densely populated or densely packed area with cameras, and uh, maybe line the game trails that we have found in the rooting activity on the ground that we have seen, more of those. And we could also use longer observation periods and GPS collar use for future research. So for conclusions, what we have determined is that wild hogs use past experiment or experiences to optimize their foraging efficiency. So the more favorable spots are the ones that tend to be closer to water, not necessarily with the higher nutrient density, as we saw with location one being closer to a stream, and the other locations that looked like they might have been very, uh, what's the word? Good, or they might have had a lot more resources. They weren't quite as close to the water, and that might be due to the trails that they cut through previously, or other animals cutting the trails as well. We also discovered that site fidelity and travel patterns can allow researchers to better prepare management practices. So how familiar they are with the area, and they know that there's going to be water at that site number one, that it's a stream. It's usually, for the most part, it has water in it all the time. But also, future research can refine strategies and population control, habitat conservation, which is the whole purpose of us studying wild hogs here in the South. They are very destructive, and they need to be mitigated in their damages. So other than that, I believe we are done. And here's our references.